House is your community organization dedicated to exploring the global issues of the time through arts, culture, and humanities program. And racial justice is the primary global issue of our time. And at iHouse, we believe that the nonprofit sector has the power to address racial inequities and create a better future in our community and in our world. And I'm heartened because you're all here with us today, and that means you believe that too. I want to thank the City of Davis Arts and Cultural Affairs Program for their support of this program and belief in this program. I want to also acknowledge that iHouse sits on the ancestral lands of the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: the Quechua-Dehee Band of Winton Indians of the Calusa Indian community, the Quetzal-Dehee Winton Nation, and the Yocha-Dehee Winton Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It's been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We're honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. We also recognize that Sacramento, where Racial Justice Advocates is located, sits on the tribal land of the Nisenan people. And we would like to acknowledge the Southern Maidu people to the north and the valley, and the Maines Miwok people to the south of the American River. Thank you all so much for being here to embrace racial equity. This is the first of a larger program that April will tell you about. And so now I will turn it back over to April and the amazing Racial Justice Advocates team.
Thank you, Shelley, for that great introduction. All right, so moving into a little bit about Racial Justice Advocates. We are a newly formed female-founded consulting company whose mission is to operationalize racial equity and cultural responsiveness within systems and organizations. Our goal is to mitigate disproportionate outcomes and remove systemic barriers impacting children and families of color within the Sacramento region and beyond. At the core of our values, we understand that beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes do not singularly contribute to systemic inequities. We believe that policies, procedures, and practices that have been founded on the constructs of racism and oppression have grossly impacted Black, Indigenous, and people of color for generations. Racial Justice Advocates, we exist to support leaders, organizations, and companies to strengthen their organizational missions and values and visions, and culture to advance racial equity, justice, and cultural responsiveness within their systems, with systems transformation as a core focus. So when we speak about racial justice, we're proactively talking about supporting organizations with creating policies, practices, and actions that are equitable and create just outcomes for all. So this work is not only about being not racist, right? It's about, instead, it focuses on sustained action and lifelong learning. So we work again with companies who serve and center community first, and we aspire to work with organizational leaders who are committed to social and racial justice. So we work with organizations that are genuinely committed to transforming their systems. And we believe that by committing to social justice and system transformation, we will engage funders, stakeholders, and the broader community in dialogue and action towards addressing the root causes of social problems affecting their communities that they serve. And so why is this work important? I think we're all here for a number of different reasons, but I think collectively, we can agree upon the fact that from the inception of our country, our systems at the local, regional, state, and federal levels have played a role in creating and maintaining racial inequities. So despite the progress that we've made over the last few decades, explicitly addressing issues of discrimination, racial inequities, there continues to be deep and pervasive racism that is persistent within our nonprofit institutions. So with the support of government and philanthropic organizations, we believe that organizations can implement strategic policy changes at multiple levels and across multiple sectors, driving larger systemic change. So doing this work together is going to be greatly important. So it is important to note that in order to achieve long-term impact, changes have to be sustainable. Working for racial equity at the state, regional, and local levels can allow for meaningful engagement with community and other institutions. And additionally, racial disparities in the nonprofit sector have contributed to the perpetuation of negative predictable outcomes and ongoing disparities for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And that fact has been magnified by recent social and systemic events. So now, I think we're all here because we realize that stronger accountability is needed among mainstream organizations in terms of how we are engaging, supporting, and serving BIPOC communities, with a heightened emphasis on racial equity and cultural responsiveness across the entire organization. And I want to again just welcome everyone who's just joining into the room. Please feel free to drop a chat, drop your name and organization and title in the chat. Okay, so just a quick agenda, let you know what we're going to be covering today. We're going to be covering racial equity, doing a brief introduction about that and what we mean when we talk about racial equity in the context of organizational development. We'll also talk about racial equity culture, and then what it means to envision racial equity for your organization. We'll cover 7 strategies to advance your work within your organization and get you started. And then we'll also talk about the Racial Equity Learning Lab that Racial Justice Advocates in partnership with iHouse has created for folks who want to continue their learning. And there'll be a brief Q&A session at the end. So the goals today are to define key terms and concepts relevant to racial equity. So there will be some documents or some terms that you may hear that may be unfamiliar throughout the course of the webinar. So we'll send some post-webinar documents at the end of the session, so you can continue to expand your knowledge about different terminology that we're using. Second, we are hoping that you can establish an understanding of racial equity principles and frameworks after this webinar. Learn to talk about race and racism by establishing shared values and a common understanding within your organization, and identify opportunities and next steps for applying concepts and strategies to advance racial equity within your organization. And as we move into this work, I think it's important for us to establish a few agreements, right? I think history matters, our present day issues and things that we're experiencing in our social climate, they matter. And also the future of this work matters as well. So one of the agreements that we have that we just kind of believe at our core is that in America, policies and structures and systems exist that deny individuals and communities of color what is necessary to live a full, fair, and equitable life. Since this country's inception, as I said earlier, these structurally racialized systems have been marked by racial bias, and that pervades our society and subsequently invades our nonprofit institutions. And so this also benefits those who identify as white and have disadvantaged people of color. Agreement 2 is that these racialized systems have worked to keep communities of color outside of the circle of human concern and perpetuate harm. And it has kept people of color out of positions of power. So examples of how laws, rules, and norms operate every day to include disproportionality are examples of looking at our criminal justice system, looking at issues of redlining, forcing communities to live into substandard and unaffordable housing, denying access to quality healthcare, education, jobs. And as we've seen most recently, the constant threat to our personal and physical safety. And also isolating communities of color from social and economic and political power. So all of these things in collection have contributed to the perpetuation of racialized harm. Additionally, back to the previous slide, please. Additionally, progress towards equity and justice has largely come from the wisdom and courage of people from communities that have been most harmed and affected by bias and a systemic oppression. So it's important to note that racial equity work must be pursued in direct solidarity and guidance from communities of color and community-based movement. So in this country, we have a hierarchy, right? So those who are in decision-making positions often determine what resources are distributed to communities and how change happens. And we really have to look at that model and flip it, right? And so really leaning into community-driven practices is going to be something that will help all of us advance racial equity, because the movement really does start from the grassroots level. And we have to embrace that in a more intentional way and redistribute power. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like later on in the webinar. And lastly, true justice cannot be achieved until individuals who work within all systems, who are conscious of and able to counter the impact of racialized system, realize that you have a role in this work as well, right? So doing so requires acknowledging that different groups are situated differently and that targeted intentional approaches are needed to reach a just and equitable society. So we can't continue to patchwork our way into this work. We really have to look at targeted approaches that will remove systemic barriers for the most impacted communities. So we'll talk a tad bit about racial equity, a brief introduction. So on this slide, of course, you're going to see a racial equity framework and the definition of racial equity. I won't go into too much detail about the definition. You can read it for yourself. But I will note that the first step in creating change is to normalize the conversation about racial equity. And by achieving a shared understanding of key concepts and what frameworks you're going to be using inside of your organization, that's going to be super important for you to advance this work. So a racial equity framework in particular sees racism as both an individual and an institutional issue, right? So it's both explicit and implicit. And everyone within your organization needs to share these understandings. That's going to be centrally important to this work. So everyone within your organization has to have a baseline, right? So you have to have a shared understanding of this. So once everyone's on the same page, you can be able to treat racial equity as a top priority by identifying your commitments, setting goals, making a plan, and holding yourself accountable. So bringing about change within your organization requires the organization as an entirety, right? So it's not just folks who are doing the work at the ground level, it is your boards, it is your executive leadership, it is your HR department. Everyone in combination has to be a part of this process. So internally, particular to nonprofits, it's important to have an infrastructure to build expertise on racial equity within your organization. So this might mean training your existing staff, identifying your racial equity champions, hiring additional staff, or working with a consultant, for example, if that's available to you. Externally, you can also work with others who are seeking change. So identifying who your peer networks are, what other organizations in your peer network are also doing this work, and maybe building some sort of coalition or a work group so that you can, again, have some support in advancing this work. And also when you coalition build among individuals and peers who have a shared understanding of the value of this work, you have an opportunity to have greater impact in your community. And finally, operationalizing change means having the tools and information to make and track your change, right? So internal and external assessments, activities, and guidelines will help your organization follow evidence-based practices that have been tried and proven successful. That will support you in implementing your strategy as well. And then we'll talk more later on about how data plays such a critical role in allowing organizations to create a baseline, set goals, and track your progress. So the disaggregation of data by race, gender is super important. And we'll talk more about that later on in the webinar. Also, when we get to towards the end of the webinar and I go through the steps, I'll give you a little bit more detail about disaggregation of data and what that means. All right, so when we talk about, we just talked about on the last few slides about why racial equity is important, right? About the system. So here's some data, this data is specific to African Americans, but this is national data for African Americans that are consistent, that prove that there are consistent inequities across all major systems. And this data can be very glaring. But if we look at it, it speaks to African Americans being 2 to 3 times, sometimes 5 times more likely to experience racial inequities in major systems, from our education systems all the way to criminal justice, right? And so these same statistics can also be localized and identified right here in your own communities. They're specific here in Sacramento County. So I know that those who are in Yolo County can probably identify some similarities in your communities. So speaking specifically about nonprofits, nearly every indicator across key issues shows significant racial equity gaps. Um, Individuals who identify as Black fare worse than their white counterparts across every age, income level, education, wealth, as it pertains to their economic stability, life expectancy, and rates of incarceration. That's something we all need to be concerned about. That is a moral imperative that we have to reconcile. And these disparities highlight some very startling circumstances for these communities. And so as you process this data, think about how these disparities may be reflected in the context of your organizations. What initially sticks out to you, right? And you can feel free to drop this in the chat, but what are your initial thoughts as you're processing this data? And so as you begin reflecting or sharing your thoughts in the chat, think about things specific to your organization, like the composition of your racial composition of your board, racial composition of key leadership positions, where decisions are being made about where your organization's direction is, who you're serving, where resources are going. This can include hiring, strategic planning, program development, et cetera. So begin to think about how you can take some of this glaring national data and localize it right there in your organization to identify some potential racial equity gaps. So if you're in an organization that is a community-based organization, meaning you have direct service and direct contact with community members, think about the racial representation across direct service staff, specifically those that are serving racially diverse families and communities. Are these individuals reflective of the communities you serve? Do they come from the communities that they serve? Are there barriers for these folks to work for your organization? Maybe there are educational requirements that may present barriers for individuals to work within your organization. Also, what are think about some of the disparities that may be happening in your organization, within your community that you serve, such as infant mortality, history of economic disinvestment, disenfranchisement. Consider how your organization is addressing these issues and engaging your community. That is so important. And research shows that these glaring gaps are due to an absence of racial equity focus and lens within our organizations. And that's something that, again, you came here to reconcile. So that's important for us to note that we can fix this. And so again, if you have some thoughts, please feel free to share those in the chat. And yes, I see a question about the slides. I will certainly share the slides, and there will be a toolkit that will go out after the webinar. Additionally, as we're continuing to speak about racial equity gaps within our sector, here's another example, and it's specifically related to the racial equity leadership, the racial leadership gap. And so an organization called Building Movement Project has done a great deal of research, researching racial equity gaps in leadership across California and nationally. And so what has been determined is that a racial leadership gap is pervasive in the nonprofit sector, and that's caused by a number of factors, including culture, organizational culture, systemic practices and policies, and barriers. And Black, Indigenous, and people of color continue to be underrepresented at the senior, executive, and board levels of leadership. And that naturally has consequences to how an organization runs and how we're effectively serving our communities. Here in Sacramento specifically, being number 2 in the country behind Washington, DC for nonprofits per capita, there's a disparity in the number of white-led and founded nonprofits versus the number of Black, Indigenous, and people of color founded and led nonprofits. That also connects to a racial equity gap. And so over the years, nonprofits, philanthropic organizations, other social service or social sector organizations have only narrowly focused on expanding the pipeline of Black, Indigenous, and people of color within the nonprofit sector. And that only has been kind of by representation by numbers, right? And unfortunately, research shows that while this pipeline has been healthy at the front door, it's not sustainable. And a lot of that is really due to the organizational conditions and the structures of the organizations that don't create the necessary conditions for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to thrive within these organizations. And so naturally, folks come in and then they naturally exit because of those conditions. And so again, focusing specifically on increasing your number of representation by numbers is only simply filling positions, but it does not mean that we are moving towards racial equity. What organizations have to do to reconcile this is to address the changes that are needed with the mindsets of our organizations, our systems, our procedures, our practices. This will allow these leaders to thrive within their organization. So this means taking a critical look at your organization, our organizational climate, and identifying potential pitfalls and barriers. So I know I just said a lot, but these are the key factors. So we're talking about what's going on in our communities and also what's happening in our organizations, and really thinking about that in a real critical way. All right, so I'm gonna move into racial equity culture and talk a little bit about that and what this means. So what is racial equity culture? So as I said in the previous slide, we can't just focus on improving our systems by representation. We really have to look at our organizational conditions. And that starts by assessing our organizational's historical culture. And so when I talk about that, I'm looking at an organizational culture that is focused on proactive counteraction of racial inequities, both inside and outside of the organization. So consider racial equity culture almost like an antidote, right? So building racial equity culture is foundational work that must happen first as organizations seek to advance racial equity work. Racial equity culture is the contrast of white dominant culture, often called white supremacy culture. And if you folks apply and attend the learning lab that we'll talk a little bit about later, there's an opportunity to dig a little deeper into white supremacy culture and what we mean by that. But this culture promotes assimilation over integration and inclusion, and dismisses opportunities to create a more inclusive and equitable environment. And that is partly why organizations have sometimes failed to sustain diverse individuals within their organizations. So establishing racial equity culture means creating conditions that help us adopt anti-racist mindsets and actions as individuals, and to center racial equity in our life and in our work, right? So it has to occur first. So what does this all mean? There's a quote that I've been using for the last decade in nonprofit administration, and you may have heard this before, but culture trumps strategy every time. So culture is everywhere and it's long-term. It transcends boards, it transcends leadership, it transcends staff. Data indicates that the average tenure of an executive director in a nonprofit sector is about 8 to 10 years. And while nonprofit staff is about 4 years. So it's foolish of us to really think that any one strategy is going to be sustainable to reconcile racial inequities, no matter how well thought out it is. It won't be faithfully passed down from one executive to another. A shift in leadership often leads to a shift in direction within the organization. So creating the conditions and culture speaks to how your organization thinks, how you recruit, how you engage with the community. So strong organizations have resilient cultures, and this is central to advancing racial equity. And I understand, I've done this work for a long time. Shifting culture is incredibly difficult work. It's challenging, but if we're serious about racial equity work, which we are because we're all here, we have to set new goals, new intentions for this work, and we have to reimagine what it looks like. And so progress will really require us to challenge our own perspectives and our approaches. And it requires us to go beyond our intellectualized expertise as it pertains to how we've historically defined success. So it challenges us to mobilize innovation, challenge us to redefine power, who holds power within our organization, lift up the voices of our staff members, or those who are trusted messengers in our communities. To do so creates a new culture, and it enhances your organization's ability to thrive and be sustainable. But of course, this does not come without challenges that we'll briefly discuss on the next slide. So common challenges that we're seeing are uncertainty, lack of awareness, and impatience as folks are trying to operationalize this work. And so as there's more and more interest from organizational leaders who are expressing a desire to learn how to be more anti-racist or how to adopt racial equity and cultural responsiveness within their organizations, as you begin these efforts, folks are facing challenges. Let's just be honest. Where do I start? What tools do I use? What frameworks? What does it all mean to my organization? How do I start? And so based on many conversations that I've had, these are the three reoccurring themes that come up. And so when I speak to uncertainty, folks are thinking about where do I start and how, right? So, leaders who identify as white may fear that they're doing something wrong or be perceived as or blind towards certain experiences or issues that are coming up. And then leaders of color on the flip side who are in positions of power or who are in organizations that are predominantly white have had experiences of being stigmatized or dismissed as angry or too passionate if they raise concerns about inequity, which is a huge problem within our organizations. And so those are just some areas of uncertainty. I'm sure there are more. If you have some different experiences, please drop them in the chat. But those are some of the most common ones that are coming up when I'm talking about uncertainty. Lack of awareness. This can be leaders who identify as white or working in predominantly diverse communities may naturally view themselves as anti-racist or even colorblind, right? However, the most committed leaders can be unaware of the ways in which we contribute to structural racism because it is so pervasive. And so for all of us to increase our awareness and consciousness around these topics, we have to continually do our work. And we'll discuss that a little bit more at the end of the workshop. But it is important for us to constantly be in the practice of learning to increase our awareness so we can be effective in our practice in this work. And then impatience. This is where I get kind of situated in impatience, right? I want to see change. I want to see it happen right now. But the reality is, even with the most strategic plan and the most impressive frameworks, we still aren't getting the change that we seek. And oftentimes that's because our historical organizational culture is very transactional. We are used to checking boxes. We are used to seeing change happen really fast. And that really is in contradiction to racial equity work. This work is long-term and you're not going to see it happen overnight, right? But, what does that all mean in reality to this work? How long does it take? Well, to be honest, we're looking at eradicating a 402-year-old system. That's not going to happen overnight. So we just got to do our part. So I'm going to pop up a poll really quick, and I'm going to ask you all a quick question as it pertains to common challenges. And as you begin to operationalize or have begun to operationalize racial equity in your organization, what is the most common challenge that you experience? And you can only choose one. I've heard in this workshop and webinar that folks want to choose all of them, but just choose the one that comes up for you the most. We'll give folks a couple seconds to answer the poll. And feel free to drop comments in the chat. I see that. Thank you, Cindy. Lack of awareness in Davis. It's exhausting to feel like you have to constantly educate people. Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. So the one that's coming up most is lack of awareness, followed by uncertainty and impatience. Okay. So I would love to hear more thoughts or see more thoughts in the chat about lack of awareness. Please share your thoughts on that. Um, would love to learn more about this. Okay, that's good to note too. All right, I'm going to end the poll. So yeah, lack of awareness was the #1 selected choice. So yeah, so that could mean a number of different things. It could mean that there's an absence of capacity building tools. What frameworks are we using? Is there a shared coalition that's working together on this work in the nonprofit sector in your community? What are those things that we can do to support nonprofit leaders in remedying the lack of awareness? And we can talk more about that in the Q&A section. Thank you so much for participating in that. All right, next slide. Okay, so I know I'm rolling through content really quick, but I know it's important to also note and identify the 4 levels of racism. And so that's what this slide is about. So as you're looking at this image, hopefully we all understand that there are 4 levels of racism that operate within our systems. And that is individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. And I'll cover some of those definitions in a second. But the most common understanding of racism in our country is limited to the interpersonal level of racism. So thinking about personal prejudices and intentional bias, our individual interactions. So the things that we can tangibly see, we deem as racist, right? But a different and emerging explanation of racism contends that interpersonal racism is actually a symptom of a more fundamental system of racism, in an array of cultural norms and institutional policies and practices that routinely produce racially inequitable outcomes, often without individual intent or malice. So I'm going to let that resonate, right? So it's not the intentional acts of racism that are perpetuating, inequitable outcomes. It is the institutional policies, practices that are producing racial inequitable outcomes. And so when we talk about internalized racism, we're thinking about racism that lies within individuals, right? So this form of racism comprises of our private beliefs and biases pertaining to race and racism. And that's influenced by our culture. And that takes on many different forms, including prejudice towards other races, internalized oppression, negative beliefs about oneself if you're a person of color, or internalized privilege, beliefs about superiority, entitlement, etc. Interpersonal racism, that's personally mediated, that occurs between individuals. So the bias that occurs when individuals interact with each other, and their personal racial beliefs affect their public interactions. And so that can mean decisions that you may be making or one may be making within an organization that could be based in interpersonal racism. Institutional racism, of course, occurs within institutions and systems of power. And this refers to unfair policies and discriminatory practices of particular institutions, such as schools, workplaces, government entities, et cetera. And that this sort of racism routinely produces racially inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages people who identify as dominant culture. And individuals within institutions take on the power of the institution when racial inequities are reinforced. So if you're going into an institution that is already perpetuating racial inequities and you go into that system as a leader or decision maker, and we don't work to disrupt it, we naturally are upholding the system of racism, sometimes consciously, but more often than not, it's unconscious because we don't understand the levels of racism and how pervasive they are. And structural racism is racism based on racial bias among institutions across our society. So this involves the cumulative and compounding effects of an array of societal factors, including history, culture, ideology, institutions, and their policies, which have systematically privileged white individuals and disadvantaged people of colors, right? So this is the fight here, right? Our fight is institutional and our fight is systemic. And so this is the most pervasive form of racism, and it is important for us to know how to combat it, or at least know how it operates so we can figure out how to combat it. And so a common pitfall for racial equity work made by leaders who begin to grapple with the concepts of anti-racism is that racial inequity, we don't have a true understanding of racism and the ways in which it manifests within our organizations. And this topic can't be glossed over. In order to eradicate racism or racist policies, practices, procedures, we have to know how to identify it at all levels. And so knowing that race and racism is a social construct that has deep societal impact, it is necessary for us in the nonprofit sector to adopt racial equity as a moral and strategic imperative. That's the only way that we're going to stay focused and steadfast on eliminating racism and shifting our axis towards racial equity. And so while this may be obvious to some, this may be new news to others, we have to think about how we recognize that we participate in a racist system. And that's not a shock, right? I think the more and more we learn, the more and more we see in our society, we understand that we exist in a racist system. And that continues to exclude and undervalue Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So we have to confront the root causes. And in order to achieve organizational transformation, we have to build racial equity culture at all levels. That's imperative for us to understand and comprehend. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next few slides. Okay, so envisioning racial equity. So here's some anecdotes. So as we're talking about the 4 levels of racism and how they exist within our society and in our organizations, here's something that we can do to combat racism. And this happens at 5 different levels. So this is an approach that can be used just as an individual, right? As a person who is in the nonprofit sector, a person who is trying to adopt an anti-racist mindset in our society. Here's some steps that you can take. So at the individual level, it causes us to be more conscious, right? So increasing our understanding and our awareness about the work we need to do for ourselves to combat implicit and explicit racism is key, right? So that has to happen first. We have to do our own work before we can step into our organizations and start to activate change. Next, interpersonal. So growing our racial equity muscles. So growing our competence, coming to webinars such as this, continuing to read, expanding your knowledge, building your confidence so that you can go into your organization and effectively lead, guide, and facilitate dialogues and strategies to implement and operationalize racial equity culture within your organization. And for organizations with a stated commitment to racial equity and justice, you have to analyze whether you are actually walking your walk. Or is it just all talk? Is it just statements? Is it just intellectualized and anecdotal support? Are you actually behaving in ways that are consistent with racial equity values and that you're being intentional? That's centrally important as well as an organization. So that takes work, that takes kind of extrapolating within your organization what some of the challenges are, and really coming to some conclusions about your starting points, what your midterm success goals look like, and your long-term success goals. That's going to be really critical. And then also probably one of the most central strategy is centering community. So centering questions such as how we hold ourselves accountable as nonprofit organizations to communities that are most harmed by structural racism, and who are the furthest away from power to do anything about it. So as nonprofit leaders, we are in a position to serve communities. So we have to center communities first, right? That is going to be important. So making sure that we are shifting power, making sure that we understand how to successfully include community members in our decision-making processes and the development of our programming and our strategies, resource allocation, et cetera. That's important as well. And then systemically, consider how and whether you are aligned and allied with social justice movements. And also making sure that you identify that that's okay to do so. I've heard some organizational leaders kind of stray away from, well, we're not an organization that focuses on social justice. Well, in fact, you do. If you have taken a charge and a commitment to work in a community, you in fact are a social justice centered organization. We are working on behalf of the community. We are here for community, and it is our obligation to understand how the system of racism structurally is harming our community members, and we have to be a participant in that work as well. So all of this in combination helps us begin to envision racial equity culture. So when your organization is fully committed to racial equity, the associated values become a part of its DNA. And this moves organizations beyond special initiatives, task forces, groups, and that checkbox training approach to full integration of racial equity in every aspect that it operates within its programs. So organizations that demonstrate this commitment will begin to exhibit the following characteristics. But this has to begin with leadership too. So the following characteristics are: leadership is reflective of various races, ethnicities, cultures within your organization and at all levels of leadership. This is dependent on and reflective of specific demographics of the communities in which your organization serves and operates. Conversations about racial equity are normalized. Stakeholders and leaders are skilled and supported when talking about race and racism and their implications as it pertains to the organization. Next, programs are culturally responsive and explicit about addressing issues of race and racism and racial equity. Intentional focus on redefining and redistributing power. I know I've said that a lot, so it is so important. I can't repeat it enough. Communities are viewed as stakeholders, community leaders, and assets to our work. And also, evaluation efforts incorporate the disaggregation of data, and continuous improvement of racial equity is prioritized. So oftentimes I hear folks kind of think about racial equity, cultural responsiveness work, again, almost like a thing that you pick up and put down when it's, when it serves an organization. But honestly, this is something that has to be embedded and across your organizational DNA. Right? So this moves your organization past special initiatives, task force groups, checkbox training approaches to full integration of racial equity in every aspect of your operations and programs. So as I said, this has to start with leadership, right? So within the context of racial equity culture, we are constantly challenging, as I said earlier, the definition of power and leadership. And this is because traditionally, leadership has been attached to dominant culture norms. And within that context, hierarchy, leadership, management and power has been influenced by white women and white men. And historically, dominant culture norms have not embraced wholeheartedly racial diversity beyond representation in numbers, as we spoke about on the racial equity and gap in leadership slide. So in contrast, racial equity challenges these norms by shifting the internal power structure, and it dilutes the presence of dominant culture within organizations. And so this gives power and voice to people of color and their lived experiences, both within the daily operations and the broader strategic and decision-making context. So for the purposes of this webinar, leadership is defined as individuals within an organization who can influence a group to progress and proceed towards an objective. So as you see in that definition, there's no hierarchy there. That means that individuals may not or may be in traditional positions that are defined by hierarchical norms, right? So this means your staff have power to influence change. Your community members have power to influence change. Your HR person, anyone within the organization who has a lens of racial equity has power within your organization to influence change, right? And this also includes your board, your executive leadership, your supervisors, all of those things. And so now that we kind of have that clear, in order to activate transformation within your organization, organizational leaders have to make sure that we're learning the history and context of structural racism in the United States, in our communities, in our organizations, and how it has affected Black, Indigenous, and people of color. This means expanding your knowledge, doing your work, reviewing websites such as racial equity tools. I see that there's a good one dropped in the chat as well. Joining groups that are focused on anti-racism, anti-oppression work, as well as affinity groups and collective healing groups. But of course, it doesn't stop there. This work is lifelong. Also, listen to the lived experiences, both within your organization and outside of your organization, of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, without placing the emotional burden on them justifying their experiences. And so I always say, when Black, Indigenous, and people of color say they're experiencing racism or racialized harm, just simply believe them. Don't push them to justify their experiences. Just listen and understand how we can improve our supports in our organizations, particularly. Reflect also on the role you play potentially in perpetuating structural racism and dominant culture within our organizations. And while we didn't create these systems, again, we have a responsibility to disrupt and dismantle them. So it's important for us to constantly assess as leaders where we're playing a role in perpetuating structural racism. So are we making sure that we're listening to the lived experiences of folks within our organization when they're saying that they're experiencing harm, and making sure that we're changing either policies or practice to be more supportive of those individuals? If we are not paying attention, then we are naturally upholding the system of racism within our organization. And then lastly, challenge ourselves. So racial equity work, it will challenge you to decolonize our thought process and our personal belief. I'm in the constant practice of understanding how to decolonize my mindset, how to implement concepts of liberation, assessing my personal beliefs, my values, my norms, my practices, and also as an organizational leader and a community activist, I'm constantly assessing these things personally, even as a woman of color. And so this means understanding the effects and consequences of white dominant culture. It is real, and again, it's pervasive. So we have to interrogate that narrative and understand our own bias, our own identity, our role in enabling and propagating structural racism within our organization. And that, again, that requires us to constantly be in the active practice of doing our own work. And so as a person who may identify as white, just a last kind of anecdote is, as you're engaging in this work or continuing your work, be mindful of placing the burden on people of color to explain the system to you. Hold yourself accountable. There's great resources being dropped in the chat. You have to acknowledge that America's history of whiteness and issues of power and privilege has consistently, consciously and unconsciously perpetuated culture of white supremacy. And that structure has long-lasting impacts on communities of color. So throughout this process, it's going to be important for us to openly explore and address how to eradicate that mindset from our mentalities. And so we're going to move on to the next slide and begin discussing 7 strategies to get started in this work. So step 1, it's a pretty simple one. Name racial equity work as a moral and strategic imperative for your organization. Define and communicate how racial equity connects to your mission, your vision, your organizational values and strategies. So make sure that racial equity is at the center of everything that you do. Hold it as your North Star. Define and communicate how racial equity work helps an organization achieve your mission. So, things like identifying root causes, potential solutions, what are the actions needed? That's all really deeper work. But step 1 is just naming it and claiming it as a moral and strategic imperative. That's an easy thing to do because once you identify it as your North Star, now you have a trajectory. Step 2, and I'll send some information out post this webinar, some key definitions, some additional reading materials, as well as the slides for the webinar. So establishing a shared vocabulary is super important. Ground your organization in the shared meaning about racial equity, and the 4 racisms, as well as cultural responsiveness and any other terms related to this work. I always share with people that no matter what organization or system that I'm working with, racial equity may mean something different to your organization depending on who you work with, what your organizational mission and vision is. So it's important to take the key definition of racial equity, but then understand what it means for your particular organization. And the important thing about racial equity work in particular is that words, of course, and their multiple uses have great meaning in our society. And so in the context of racial equity work, misunderstanding words during our discussions on race often lead to confusion, which can lead to conflict, controversy, etc. So establishing a shared vocabulary is essential to achieve some degree of shared understanding and collective visioning. So using this as your starting point is a great way to enhance and begin to establish conversations within your organization about racial equity. So again, if you have any questions about that, please reach out to me, but I'll send some resources out after the webinar. So once we've established that we're naming it, we're claiming it, and we are establishing our shared vocabulary, open a continuous dialogue about racial equity and cultural responsiveness within your organization. And so there are a number of ways to engage in effective conversations about racial equity. You can host brown bag lunches, right? I mean, simple things. You can embed racial equity and cultural responsiveness as an ongoing meeting agenda item. That is something as a leader that we've done historically, just to even start the dialogue and ensure that it is important and that it's remaining in our purview at every point within our organization. So this ensures that these conversations remain at the forefront of your work. If you envision or you think that there may be any challenges that may come up, or maybe you still have something to learn, you may not feel as confident in leading dialogues at this point in your learning curve, consider hiring an outside facilitator or inviting folks, stipending folks in your community who are leaders in this work to come speak and have discussions that can be effectively managed to get the conversation started in your organization. And also, it's important too, and I'll send an example of these out as well in the post-webinar docs. As you're beginning to have these dialogues, make sure you implement community agreements. This ensures that there are rules for engagement, and it ensures that people within your organization feel heard, supported, and validated and safe, which is really important, safe to have these conversations. Right, step 4, commit to ongoing leadership development at all levels within the organization and identify your racial equity champions. So as mentioned previously, those identified as leaders within your organization set the tone for this work. So identify your champions. Who are those individuals who are pushing the envelope, who are raising racial equity as a concern? How can we redistribute power within our organization to give these individuals voice, position, and proximity to support and lead these efforts? But keeping in mind that if this is line staff or if this is someone that already has a full load, how can we remove something from their plate or their workload to allow space, or even stipending staff? I've seen that happen, or increases in raises because this work, increases in wages because this work is really emotionally daunting. So if we are pulling people from positions that already have a workload, a full workload, think about how we can redistribute some tasks to allow them time to really lean into this work, especially during this critical time in our society. So identify your champions is hugely important to the success of your work within your organization. And then moving out the way as an organizational leader and allowing others to lead if you're still on your journey. Step 5 is step 5, but it's probably one of the most important uh, steps in this process. So engaging affected populations and stakeholders. So one of the impacts of systemic racism is the exclusion of people of color um, from many avenues of decision making, as we've said many times in this webinar. So people of color are the most direct, I'd say they're the most valuable assets when we're talking about eliminating racism, right? Because it is a lived experience that we have. And so in order for us to really create change within our organizations, we have to strive to engage stakeholders who are active and have authentic relationships and are trusted messengers with the communities that we aim to serve. And so this has to be meaningful. However, it just can't be something that we're just tapping individuals and saying, hey, we need to know what's happening in the community. No, that's not how this works. This engagement has to be built in trust. And to be honest with you, that may require a great deal of work, because there is natural distrust between community and system because of historical and systemic oppression and racism. So as an organizational leader, there may be a great deal of relationship building that has to occur in order for you to have to engage in conversations with your community members. And then making sure that, again, we are distributing power and decision making. We are potentially stipending individuals for sharing their knowledge and expertise, making sure that we're just doing things a little bit differently because co-optation is real. And folks are really exhausted from sharing information with organizational leaders and not being credited or not being supported, or just almost having their ideas taken away and not being credited for those ideas. So it's important to have meaningful relationships with your affected populations as you're engaging with them.
In the chat, someone's asking, can you expand on co-optation?
Oh, I sure can. So essentially, co-optation is so historically, as it pertains to people of color, as I said earlier, when we look at who's leading grassroots movements, or kind of who's leading these innovative changes from the grassroots level, a lot of that is happening by people of color. And in the nonprofit industrial complex, oftentimes it is Latina women and Black women who are really at the epicenter of activating change. And what happens oftentimes to these individuals within organizations, specifically nonprofits, is that their ideas are taken and claimed by the organization as theirs, right? So not crediting the individual, the woman of color who raised these issues as a concern or came up with the strategies. Their ideas are basically taken from them and the organization claims them as theirs. And so that's what I mean by co-optation. That is pervasive in the nonprofit sector, especially as we're talking about engagement with communities of color. Communities of color have come to the table, listening sessions, all sorts of things, and those strategies have been taken away from them and not credited to the community, or you oftentimes don't see change happening because maybe an organization is just using it to build their resource and financial resource infrastructure. We've seen that happen multiple times. So, but there is the glossary that I'll send out has another definition of co-optation as well. And I'll drop some links in the chat during the Q&A section that expands on that concept. Step 6, disaggregate your data and begin evaluating your numbers based on race and ethnicity. And so that's just a place starter, right? You can disaggregate your data. My recommendation is disaggregate your data by multiple demographics, but in regards to racial equity, disaggregating your data by race and ethnicity is super important to activate this work. Data tells a story, and as I covered early in the webinar, negative predictable outcomes for communities of color can be identified across all systems and organizations. And so advancing racial equity for populations that we serve requires data. And typically data is reported for whole populations and it's aggregated. However, data in all focus areas of organizations and systems should be broken apart by race, gender, and other demographic variables whenever that data is available. And if that data isn't available, think about your data system and maybe having something, implementing a different data system that does disaggregate your data. And so by disaggregating data, it'll help you identify your next steps. It'll help you identify programmatic and policy shifts. Organizations should examine engagement and retention of staff, specifically diverse staff by race at all levels, and also hiring trends. Are you hiring from the community? How are you retaining these individuals? So disaggregating data can tell a great deal of stories, and that could be a place starter for you as well when it comes to this work. So thinking about your boards, what's the racial representation on your boards, and starting there if there's a barrier, looking at leadership, disaggregating that data and looking at historical trends. So all of those things are greatly important. So disaggregation of data, engaging your affected communities, although these are step 5 and step 6, I would say these are probably the two of the most important steps for your work advancing racial equity within your organization.
Leslie wants to know if the materials include specific rewording to ask folks how they identify.
I'm not really sure about that question. Leslie, maybe if you stay around for the Q&A section, I can figure out how to answer that question. Okay, thank you. All right, and step 7, just get started, right? So think about, here's some questions that I always recommend just to get people thinking about racial equity within their organization and their workplace. So think about your workplace and how racism is impacting your organization and community. And again, this can be at any level. It could be looking at your board, looking at organizational leadership, looking at your hiring trends, looking at your staff, examining the community that you serve. There's so many different places to start. And think about, ideally, envision where you want your organization to be, right? And so this isn't trying to figure it out, but think about the issues that may come up and where would you like your organization to be? Oftentimes as nonprofit leaders, we don't get an opportunity to vision. We just really don't, because we're so busy responding to contract obligations or crises that are happening in our community. We don't have an opportunity to vision. And as executive directors and leaders, that's really what our superpowers are, right? So we are big thinkers, we're individuals who love to vision forward. So this is an opportunity to really do that. So think about where you want your organization to be. And then what are your first steps in operationalizing racial equity? Is it talking to your board? Is it, activating a conversation, hosting a brown bag lunch, hiring a consultant? What are some of the first steps that you need to take as an organization to begin to operationalize this work? And then also, what's your timeline to begin working on this? So keeping a timeline is super important. And that's an important way to hold yourself accountable as well. So again, as you're thinking about these questions, and I'll drop these questions in the chat as well, consider what your timeline is, and then what resources are available to you as well. So as we're wrapping up, think about those 7 steps. I'll repeat them really quickly. So number 1, naming racial equity as a moral and strategic imperative. Number 2, establishing a shared vocabulary. Number 3, opening a continuous dialogue about racial equity and cultural responsiveness. Step 4, commit to ongoing leadership development at all levels and identify your racial equity champions. 5, engage affected populations and stakeholders. And 6, disaggregate your data and begin evaluating your numbers based on race and ethnicity. And lastly, just get started, right? So as you're thinking about just getting started, consider what type of future do you want to create? The real challenge for organizational leaders is not figuring out what we can do, but rather, are we really willing to do it? Okay, so ending racism does not happen by a wait and see approach. It does not happen by communities just working harder. Conceptualizing the task of taking on systems that oppress is exhausting work, especially for individuals who identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. And so in order to tackle racism, it requires intentional focus and action at all levels, right? And action has to be multiracial, multi-generational, across all genders. It has to be a coalition of people working together to imagine an equitable society that does not yet exist. We have to create it. So this is just one piece of the broader racial justice puzzle. So though all of us are engaged in the system, each of us gets to choose the responsibility and the time frame that we engage in this work. And this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, right? This is not a relay race, it's legacy work. So this work spans far beyond our tenures. And so we've got a lot of work to do before we all are retired. So all of these things collectively moves us beyond performative statements of support and moves us to action. So it's time that we all get together and do this work. And so as we wrap up, I invite all of you to consider participating in, those of you that are in Yolo County, nonprofit leaders, consider participating in the Racial Equity Learning Lab that is hosted by International House in partnership with racial justice advocates. I'm gonna drop the link to that application in the chat. And I know I just covered a great deal of information. I hope that it was informative. But if you're interested in continuing to learn more about how your organization can continue to learn and grow and operationalize racial equity, please join us for the Racial Equity Lab. This learning lab is going to cover some key learning objectives, such as foundational learning. You'll continue to learn key terminology about racial justice and cultural responsiveness. Begin to continue to build your skills to normalize conversations and build a baseline of knowledge that promotes and normalizes conversations about race equity, and cultural responsiveness. Additionally, building your racial stamina and building a shared collective sense of responsibility with your peers. this is a great part of this work, is that doing cohort-based learning offers an opportunity to build collectively with other organizational leaders within your region. So this is probably one of the best parts about the cohort. So you'll actively process your learning experiences, establishing a group culture, and additionally, you'll develop individual accountability plans, and you'll have accountability partners who you're going to continue to do your self-work with beyond the workshops. And then we'll provide you with some action-centered tools, some toolkits, which will support participants in identifying the next steps in applying racial equity and cultural responsiveness to their work, and minimize predictable outcomes for the communities that they're serving. And then lastly, we again really value and promote lifelong learning. So participants that participate in this cohort will commit to integrating racial equity and cultural responsiveness as a lifestyle practice during and beyond the cohort series. So I really encourage those who are interested in participating, please go apply right now. The application will be open until April 23rd. The application process should only take about 15, maybe 20 minutes tops to complete. We don't ask a great deal of questions, but we really want to get your insight about what racial equity means to your organization, to you personally, and why it's important. So again, I hope those who are interested go ahead and apply to the cohort, and we look forward to seeing you there. And again, thank you so much for spending time with me this morning. It's about 11:18. We've got about 12 minutes left for Q&A before we wrap up. Again, my name is April Jean. I'm the Principal Consultant of Racial Justice Advocates. And it has been a pleasure being in this learning community with you this morning. I hope you found this webinar valuable. I hope you learned something. Feel free to reach out to me at april@rjadvocates916.com. I am open to chatting with any one of you at any time. So thank you so much again. And this has been really great. And I'll be here for the next couple of minutes for if anyone has some questions. Latanya, were there any questions coming up in the chat?
So from Q&A, Megan asked, our organization relies heavily on volunteers, especially parents of school-age children. How can we increase diversity beyond stay-at-home parents?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, that's a loaded question. And I think it really all depends. Because you're right, trying to engage working families is really hard, particularly women of color and men of color. So I know, for example, in Sacramento, one of the data points that sticks out to me a lot, oftentimes, especially when we were doing work with Birth and Beyond, is that about 80% of Black women are head of household in their homes, which means that they're working. So when we looked at trying to engage folks at the family resource centers, it was really hard to get representation at those levels. So things that we had to do were things such as shifting the times of our activities. And I don't know if that's something that may help. So we had to offer activities later to allow opportunities for others to engage. But also it really is about building relationships as well. And understanding where people are, what they need. So I'm not sure like where to start, but you can email me and we can offline about this and chat a little bit more, so I can learn more about your organization, what your mission is, your programming, and we can chat about some strategies to help engage beyond the stay-at-home family.
Joseph asked or said, I think often a barrier to this work for organizations is how dauntingly amount of time and energy this work takes. Do you have any thoughts on capacity building and how to make space for this work?
I sure do. I think, again, participating in things such as the cohort that we just introduced is going to be a great antidote to the exhaustion that's happening at the organizational level, because this work is daunting, and we don't oftentimes know, because there are a lot of resources floating around right now. So we don't know where to start. We don't know what tools to use. So as we're designing things such as a cohort-based learning model, that's a place where you're going to find peer support. That's a place where you're going to have access to, subject matter experts in this work. There may be some technical assistance that you will be able to receive beyond the cohort. So, and then I think the most rich part about the cohort-based learning is that you're building a community with your peers. So now you have others to tap into who are also on this journey. All of those things in combination make this work less daunting. So if that question was asked prior to the introduction of the cohort and you're still on, I would encourage you to apply to participate in the racial equity learning labs that we're hosting in May.
Emily asked, can you speak a bit about how or whether a culture of urgency, productivity, or competitiveness acts as a barrier to achieving racial equity?
Can you repeat that again?
Can you speak a bit about how or whether a culture of urgency, productivity, or competitiveness acts as a barrier to achieving racial equity?
Oh, absolutely. I think all of those create a barrier to racial equity. And I think, as I covered in the workshop, racial equity challenges those norms, right? I think in our organizations, there is a culture of urgency, a culture of productivity, a culture of now, get it done now, right? And that is also tied into white supremacy culture. And again, there's a resource that I will send out after this workshop that goes more into detail of the characteristics of white supremacy culture. But again, racial equity culture challenges us to redefine how we work and re-envision how we work. This work is not a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so it is going to take us to slow down and be intentional, because when we're not intentional, when we're moving at a rabbit's pace, we naturally are going to miss something, or we're going to continue to perpetuate oppression within our organization, and we don't leave room for creativity and innovation. And so, and that's what this work is about. As I said, we're trying to create a future that doesn't exist yet. And if we're moving in a direction that continues to perpetuate a culture of now and urgency, then we are working in contradiction to racial equity. I'll take one more question, LaTanya.
Okay. Now it's a toss-up.
Give me another good one. These are all really great questions.
Kelly asks, our all volunteer org is overwhelmingly white, while our community is just 55% white. So essentially, we are starting from scratch with racial equity. Our leadership is focusing on building partnerships with more diverse orgs. Is building partnerships with more diverse orgs, inviting to co-hosting opportunities, fundraising to help other orgs hire diverse college students as interns, etc. Is this an appropriate first strategy?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I just worked with an organization not too long ago that had a similar challenge. And so they created a program to engage college youth at the junior college level. And they're paying these individuals through a scholarship to come volunteer at their volunteer at their organization. I think that is a great method. Again, we have to think about the data and think about, when we have volunteer organizations, or even let's look at our government institutions as well. We think about like commissioners and boards and things like that. Oftentimes, because of the time and the availability of different folks, only people who are maybe retired or have time or economic stability can participate in these particular activities for free. Whereas, again, as I shared with the earlier data point, there are a lot of economic barriers for people of color, particularly in Sacramento, as an example. And so it's going to be really hard to engage people at a volunteer level because of those economic challenges, especially when we think about Black women and being 81% head of household. Personally, as a single mother woman, a Black woman, it's hard for me to volunteer for anything because I have a 12-year-old and I can't, you know, anything that I do has to bring some finances into my home, right? Because I am the head of household. And so using myself as an example, again, it would be really challenging for me to volunteer and spend my time away from my home that's not bringing any income in. And so creating certain things based in that data, programming and scholarship programs, or you know, stipend-based volunteer activities for youth who are in college. All of those things can help economically, right? So those are things that we have to think about when we're creating our organizations, especially ones that are volunteer-based. What other ways can we create an infrastructure that is inclusive? And oftentimes we have to think about offering some sort of monetary compensation to combat the economic disenfranchisement and strife that has impacted our communities. So that's a really great question, and that's a really great start and a strategy. So I'm glad to hear that. Right. So that's going to close us up. Those are really great questions. Again, you have my email. It's about 11:30. Thank you all for spending this time with me this morning. I'm so excited for the applications to roll in for the cohort, and I look forward to meeting some of you, not by name in my chat box, but by face in the cohort. So thank you so much. I will send some materials out to everyone. Again, if you have any questions, please reach me at april@rjadvocates916.com. And you all have a wonderfully beautiful day.